Hello, and welcome to the lecture for Why Study Literature. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring the whys of literature before we get into specific texts this semester. A lot of times people will ask the question about why we should have general education literature. And I've designed this lecture to give you some sense of why studying literature can be important even if you're not an English major or even if you don't enjoy reading books. So I hope as we go through this lecture together, it will give you some better context for understanding why literature matters to your life. As you begin to study literature, you might have thought to yourself, why do I have to read this? What am I supposed to get out of it? What does this mean, and what's the point? These are all very basic questions that I hear a lot of the times from people who are not as interested in literature, and those are very valid questions. A lot of times when you come into a discipline like literature, it's difficult from the outside perspective, if you don't already have the taste for literature, to understand what kind of relevance it could have to you or your job or your future career or just your personal life. So I want us to think through these questions and to take them seriously so we can understand how these questions actually inform our study of literature and its importance this semester. So all of these questions can essentially be answered by saying, story is identity. This semester, we will examine how literature is actually essential to how you understand your own identity. Some of the points we'll discuss include that all cultures have stories, no matter how different they may appear. Stories are a unifying element of human experience, and story is the way that we process experience. So you'll hear me come back throughout the course of the semester to this concept of literature and identity. And that is a big theme for the class, and that will be one of our focuses throughout the course of the semester. So when you think in terms of literature, I want you to stop thinking of it as something that is out there, separate or external to yourself, and instead begin to recognize the way that story is actually part of your personal identity. One of the ways you might see this first is in the way that we tend to have conversations with a narrative structure. So I have here on this slide, you'll never believe what happened to me. If you've ever said the above phrase, then you have told a story as part of your identity. This is actually a very common phrase that you'll hear when people are telling each other things about their day or their week, or if you haven't talked to someone recently, or if you have something surprising happen. You introduce a story to a listener, and you already understand the story structure, which tends to underlie a lot of our conversations. You determine characters involved in the action. You emphasize important points of plot. You might pause for dramatic effect, and then you'll lead someone up to the punchline, to the conclusion, to the important point of the story that you're telling. So in all of these ways, you're already shaping conversation narratively, and that becomes a big part of how literature begins to function. It starts in our personal interactions and then becomes something that's written down and translated and becomes bigger than an individual person. But it really all begins with thinking of our lives as actual stories. Story becomes essential to our understanding of self because when we tell stories and our experiences, we do so because we actually process information narratively. So we're telling stories in order to explain events or to give a sense of personal history. We also view our lives teleologically. This is just a fancy word for meaning that we're moving through time from a beginning point with a middle toward an end, where the end is the goal, just like in a story. So viewing time chronologically and viewing our lives teleologically, moving towards something, towards a purpose. And we tend to structure our sense of identity, our sense of self, and even everyday conversations with this same narrative structure. And we really already think of our lives as stories. When we tell people about ourselves, we tell our life story, and that is how we begin to get to know one another, to build relationships, to build networks for our jobs. All of these things involve a storytelling process that underlies all of our communications. In fact, there's an entire genre of storytelling literature about life stories called autobiography, which I'm sure you've heard of. This process of telling and hearing life stories really does two things. It gives a sense of history because it provides your origin, how you got to where and who you are today. And then it also determines and defines your identity, helping you shape the events and people that are essential to your present self. An autobiography as a genre is essentially just where people have begun writing down those life stories that have helped them understand who they are. But all of those things are based on viewing ourselves in terms of narrative. Since we view our lives narratively, we're always writing our own life stories, even though we may not be doing so consciously. In the process of shaping your identity through story, you can start to understand how you're actually choosing which characters to remember and forget. These are people in your life that you've decided to maintain relationships with, for better or for worse. People who become sort of villain figures or who become your heroes, who are your companions, your sidekicks. All of those narrative tropes are structures that have become almost cliche in literature, but they actually arise out of life and the people that we bring into our lives and the people that we see in our lives that become these sort of character figures, even though we wouldn't necessarily label them as such consciously. We also choose which events are most formative to our present state of self. So if you think back through your life, there are probably certain events that have shaped you and helped shape your worldview. Those are your big action moments in your life story or your narrative. And all of these things, the people and the events, create an explanation of your identity and your personal history. So whether you realize it or not, you do tend to think of your life in these story-like terms. This is what's called narrative identity, and it underlies a lot of the way that we think through our life journey and our trajectories and our goals and what we want to accomplish. It's with this sense of narrative purpose. So, given the background of this narrative identity theory, what I want you to understand is that literature is really just like you. So, the stories that you're reading are coming out of cultural backgrounds where authors have taken characters and ideas and different personalities and events and shaped them into literature. So authors are picking out these stories that have major plot points that would be representative of certain people's cultural experiences. They write them down and then we read them because we can recognize in them something common to our own experiences. So when you read literature, you should be able to find some point of identification, being able to recognize stories that are uniquely human and that transcend cultural barriers. So that's really the importance of literature, is that it puts down in writing and records these common human experiences that we can all recognize and feel that we're a part of in some way. Regardless of where the author comes from or what personal backgrounds they have, they're saying something that could be representative of personal human experience overall. Even if you don't feel personally connected to literature because you don't enjoy the reading process, you're still encountering story in a lot of different forms, primarily these days in terms of film, which also has a similar narrative structure and also derives a lot from different literary texts. So I want you to think through why literature matters. It's really a record of all these different stories that went beyond one person's experiences to become a story of national, cultural, or universal human identity. And it's studied because they provide us with that sense of cultural connection and identity, demonstrating common human experiences and helping us understand essential parts of our lives: death, birth, joy, tragedy, all those kind of big ideas. Stories help us to contextualize those and to feel both entertained in the sense of perhaps a superhero movie where we can look at heroism and really think about what our values and our ideals are for heroism, as well as educated in terms of something like a documentary or a text that's a memoir when you're reading about someone's personal experiences going through a struggle that you might or might not have experienced yourself. Stories are really teaching us who we were in the past, who we are now, and who we have the potential to be. So they're really forming two different goals here: entertainment, pleasure, versus instruction or education, whether that's historical or present day social problems, or thinking about how we can be better in the future. So all of these different purposes are why literature is created and why it could speak to your life, whether or not you're an English major or whether or not you have a career in English studies. So as I mentioned, this semester we're going to be thinking about literature in terms of narrative identity theory. And for now, I want to see what you think. So have you thought of your life as a story before now, or can you see how your life might be shaped by story now that you've heard this lecture? This week, in our first discussion board post, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself to the class and share a bit of your story. And as we go through the semester, we'll be using literature as identity as the basis for our discussions. So I do want you to keep this theory in mind as you begin to read, and I'll come back to it and mention it throughout the course of the semester so that way we can understand how identity is connected to the different stories we read and how it might impact personal identity, cultural identity, even national identity as we look at stories from around the world. Thanks.